Inside the stone walls of the Capitol, under blinding lights and a nation watching, Jasmine Crockett confronts Mike Johnson, the mastermind of a ruthless urban rescue plan that pushes poor families out while the rich cash in. He laughs her off, mocks her as a distraction, but within minutes she unleashes a firestorm. Confidential recordings, rigged maps, and investor memos soaked in greed. The room turns ice cold. His face drains. The mask shatters. If power can wipe out entire communities with a pen and call it justice, what else are they erasing while we're not looking? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing chamber crackled with quiet tension, the kind that settles right before a political ambush. Beneath the Capitol's vaulted ceiling, the room resembled a courtroom disguised as a war zone. Polished mahogany desks arranged like opposing trenches. The gold-lettered placard read, "Oversight Hearing on Transparency and Ethics in the Urban Rescue Initiative." But everyone present knew this wasn't about oversight. It was about exposure. Jasmine Crockett sat poised at the left bench, her navy suit sharp against the sterile white walls. She was still unreadable, but the stack of documents before her, eviction notices, doctored land titles, buried contracts, radiated heat. Behind her, housing advocates and displaced citizens filled the gallery. Outside, chants echoed faintly, muffled by stone but steady. Then the door opened. Mike Johnson strode in with a polished calm, his suit gleaming faintly under the lights, every movement oozing entitlement. He made his way down the aisle like a man campaigning in a room he already owned, shaking hands, trading smirks. He never looked at Jasmine. To him, she wasn't competition, just background. At the front, he took his seat like a king returning to court. The chairman invited Representative Crockett to open the hearing. She inhaled, but Johnson cut in, his voice smooth and mocking. Excuse me," he said, leaning slightly into the microphone. His voice smooth, rehearsed, polished. "Before we begin, I just want to say, I must have misread the docket." He let the silence hang just long enough to create discomfort. Then with a half smirk, "I thought we were here to discuss development strategy, not to attend Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's lecture on urban resentment." A few aides chuckled, unsure whether to commit. The joke was calculated, not just to mock Jasmine's focus on the human cost of policy, but to box her into a stereotype. Emotional, dramatic, unserious. And he wasn't finished. "I mean, let's keep things grounded today," he continued, turning a page in his folder as if reviewing a shopping list. "This is Congress. We're here to talk about cranes and concrete, not poetry and protest signs." The room stilled. Some members shifted in their chairs. The remarks hadn't just been dismissive, they were surgical. Johnson was drawing a line. "I am reality. She is theater." But Jasmine didn't rise to the bait. Her gaze never wavered, her face an impenetrable mask. What Johnson mistook for silence was precision. She knew exactly what he was doing. She had seen men like him, men who believed their suits made them righteous, that their tone absolved their cruelty. And she knew what came next. The real hearing hadn't started yet. This was only his opening performance. And like every showman drunk on his own applause, he didn't realize the trap had already been set. The smirk was still resting on Mike Johnson's lips when Jasmine Crockett reached for her laptop. Not with haste, but with a kind of practiced calm that unnerved more than any raised voice could. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her fingers moved across the keyboard like a pianist preparing for a concerto, silent and precise. The lights dimmed slightly as the projector activated behind her, casting its glow onto the wall like an unfolding indictment. The screen came alive with color-coded overlays, district lines, zoning codes, and a legend that bled red where lives had already been uprooted. The map zoomed slowly into frame, and 7 neighborhoods lit up like open wounds. Bold black text labeled them clearly: East Elridge, South Montclair, Ward 9, Hollow Creek, Vista Gardens, Lake Harlan, Dubois Terrace. Each name landed like a courtroom exhibit, a flash of memory for someone in the audience who had lost a home, a neighbor, a street they once knew by heart. Jasmine didn't narrate, not at first. She let the room absorb what it was seeing, the concentration of red, the unnatural symmetry of injustice. Then with a keystroke, the next layer appeared. Demographics. A sidebar listed the data with chilling precision. 6 of the 7 neighborhoods had populations that were over 80% Black or Latino. Their median household incomes ranged from $14,300 to $17,800. Average eviction rates were nearly 3 times the city's norm. It wasn't just urban poverty, it was engineered vulnerability. A silence spread over the room like fog. No one shuffled papers. No aides whispered. Even the cameras hesitated, as if unsure whether to zoom in or stay wide. She didn't look at the screen. She looked at him. "Mr. Johnson," Jasmine began, her voice low but immovable, "could you explain for the record why 92% of the Urban Rescue Initiative's Phase 1 target zone overlaps with the poorest, most racially segregated neighborhoods in this state?" Her eyes didn't waver. "And why not a single square mile of that zone touches the waterfront industrial lots owned by Lexington Holdings, Hartwell Realty, or Sycamore Capital? 3 of the largest commercial landholders in the city, and incidentally, 3 of your top campaign contributors?" The question was a scalpel masked as a sentence. It didn't shout, it sliced. A slow wave of tension moved through the hearing room, the kind that turns breath into a liability. One of Johnson's aides scribbled something in the margins of a memo. A journalist looked up, startled, unsure if they had just missed the beginning of the real story. For a split second, Mike Johnson's posture faltered. He adjusted his cufflinks, an unconscious tic, and glanced briefly at the screen before forcing a relaxed lean into the microphone. "Well," he said with exaggerated courtesy, "Congresswoman Crockett, perhaps it's because those neighborhoods need rescuing the most." His voice dripped with practiced paternalism, the kind of tone used by people who believe their power gives them moral clarity. He stretched the word rescuing like a silk ribbon across barbed wire. "You of all people," he added, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "should understand the urgency of improving living conditions in communities like these." It was the kind of reply designed not to answer, but to reframe, to turn displacement into charity, to cast demolition as benevolence. But the gallery didn't buy it. Jasmine heard it in the small intake of breath from a mother sitting 3 rows back. Saw it in the way a man in a construction uniform clenched his jaw. Someone whispered shameful under their breath. Johnson continued flipping through his folder as if he were paging through dinner menus, unfazed. But the air had changed. It was thicker now, denser, and even he could feel it. What Mike Johnson failed to realize, what men like him so often miss, is that power projected without precision collapses under scrutiny. Jasmine hadn't come to prove him wrong with volume. She came with evidence, with patterns, with numbers soaked in the bloodless violence of policy. And when she spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She simply raised the floor he was standing on and let the truth do the rest. The map behind her didn't fade. It glowed, red, bold, and unmovable, just like her. The data had wounded him, but Jasmine wasn't finished. Numbers might expose intent, but only faces could reveal consequence. She paused, glanced at the committee chair, then silently queued another file. The lights dimmed once more as the screen behind her lit up, not with graphs or zoning overlays, but with the unsteady frame of a handheld phone camera. "This was recorded at 3:04 a.m. last Tuesday," she said softly. "Ward 9, Phase 1. The chamber quieted to a hush that felt unnatural. The footage began. The glow of police lights bled through the night fog, blue and red swirling over cracked pavement and shuttered porches. The audio was raw. No narration, no filters, just the frantic voice of a woman off-screen. "Please, officer, just let me stay until morning. He's 6. He's sleeping." The camera shifted, catching her in frame. A woman in a grease-stained work uniform, barefoot, one arm shielding her child, the other raised instinctively between herself and 2 officers standing at her front door. Their helmets gleamed under the streetlight. Behind them, a squad car idled with its doors open, engine purring like an executioner waiting to be summoned. Then came the boy. A small figure stumbled into view, dragging a tattered blanket behind him. his face twisted in the kind of terror too primal to be performed. "Mama!" he called out, his voice thin and cracked with sleep. The mother turned, dropped to her knees, wrapped both arms around him. But within seconds, one of the officers stepped forward and ordered them off the property. The camera trembled as its holder gasped audibly. In the distance, a neighbor could be heard yelling, "He didn't even get notice!" But the officers didn't turn. The screen went black as the recording ended. The chamber remained frozen. The image of that boy, barefoot, clutching his mother, now scorched into the minds of every person present. Jasmine stood still, hands folded, letting the silence speak before she did. It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. She knew the weight of stillness when truth had just been made visible. Mike Johnson's voice cut in like static. "Law enforcement acted within the bounds of a signed warrant," he said, his tone steady but thinner than before. "All removals conducted under the Urban Rescue Initiative are supported by due process. That footage, while emotional, does not reflect any violation of procedure." His words echoed off the marble like bureaucratic armor being strapped on in real time. He sounded prepared, but not unmoved, not quite. Something in the gallery had shifted. The tension now clung to him. Johnson glanced down at his notes, then back at Jasmine, his lips parting slightly, perhaps expecting her to escalate with outrage. But she didn't raise her voice. Her tone dropped lower, more precise. "You're right about one thing," she said. "That footage is emotional because what it shows isn't a violation of procedure. That's the problem." Her words fell like hammer blows, steady and spaced. "The system you signed into law allowed a mother to be dragged from her home at 3 a.m. while her son screamed in his pajamas. And because every box was checked, you think that makes it clean." She took a breath, not out of fatigue, but control. "But legal does not mean ethical. Lawful does not mean just. And procedure does not absolve policy that brutalizes the people it claims to rescue." She stepped back, her gaze never leaving his, her presence more commanding than any raised voice could be. Across the gallery, heads nodded, not in anger, but in recognition, the kind of slow, painful acknowledgement that comes when someone finally names a thing no one in power had the courage to say. And for the first time since the hearing began, Mike Johnson didn't interrupt, because Jasmine had just weaponized silence, and every second he didn't speak made it louder. The silence after Jasmine's last words was still heavy in the room, but she didn't stop. She clicked the remote again. The screen behind her changed, not to more video or maps, but to something colder: paperwork, profits. "Now," she said calmly, "let's talk about what this project was really designed to rescue." The audience leaned forward. A scanned document appeared, marked "Confidential, Internal Use Only." It was a financial report from Lexington Growth Fund, one of the biggest investment firms behind the Urban Rescue Initiative. In the center of the slide, highlighted in bold black letters, was a sentence that made the whole room tighten. "Estimated property value increase 6x to 9x within 12 to 18 months post-removal of low-yield populations." There it was. No emotion, just numbers. And behind them, people erased like they didn't matter. "Removal. Low-yield populations," Jasmine said again, clearly and slowly. "That's how they describe the families in East Elridge, in Ward 9, in Hollow Creek, people with jobs, with children, with lives." She paused, letting the room feel the weight of those words. "But to these investors, they're just in the way." Her voice was steady, calm, but every word hit harder than the last. She clicked again. A second slide appeared. This time, a donation record showing names like Urban Reforge LLC, Selwyn Partners, Ridgefront Holdings. "These companies are all part of Lexington," Jasmine explained. "Together, they gave $2.1 million to a political group called American Future. The timing? Right after Phase 1 of this plan was approved." She tapped again. Another slide. This one showed where that money went. Most of it, nearly 3/4, was spent supporting one candidate's campaign. She turned to face him fully. "That candidate," she said clearly, "was you, Mr. Johnson." Now the room shifted. Even the air felt tighter. Jasmine continued without raising her voice. "I'm not saying this was illegal. That's not for me to decide. But let's call it what it is. The people who said poor neighborhoods should be cleared for profit are the same people who helped fund the campaign of the man who signed off on the clearing. Johnson didn't move much, just a slight twitch in his face. But it was the first time he showed anything that resembled discomfort. His body no longer looked so confident. He was sitting smaller now, more still. Jasmine stepped forward just enough to close the space between the evidence on the wall and the man who was being asked to answer for it. "This isn't about smart planning," she said. "It's about responsibility. This is a program dressed up as public good, but it was built on a business model that expected people to be pushed out. That needed people to lose their homes to make the numbers work." She set her hand gently on the table. No slamming, no shouting, just finality. "So my question, Mr. Johnson, isn't whether you built something. It's whether you sold it, sold people's homes, lives, and futures before they even knew what was happening." The chamber didn't make a sound, not a breath, not a cough. Even power, for once, felt quiet. Because Jasmine wasn't just revealing facts. She was revealing the truth behind the system, and she wasn't asking for mercy. She was demanding justice. The silence that followed Jasmine's dismantling of the money trail wasn't just heavy, it was radioactive. Mike Johnson sat frozen for a beat too long, the flicker of restraint in his eyes beginning to falter under the weight of the moment. Then, like a pressure valve snapping loose, he pushed forward in his seat, the microphone catching the sharp intake of breath before his voice cracked the air. "You're twisting facts into fiction," he said, louder than necessary, his tone edged with the bitterness of a man no longer speaking to convince, but to contain. "You're building conspiracies out of shadows. Just enough suggestion to make it sound sinister, but nothing real, nothing actionable." His hand gripped the table now, two fingers tapping in quick, uneven rhythm. "I didn't sell land. I don't own the land. I don't profit from what happens after revitalization," he said, each word clipped, his rhythm accelerating. "What I did, what this initiative does, is create opportunity. We rebuild what was decaying. We bring investment into places that were ignored for decades." He stopped for a moment, but only to catch breath, not clarity. His voice, when it returned, came harder, angrier, and less refined. "You want to stand there and accuse me of orchestrating some corporate takeover while ignoring the truth, that these communities were falling apart long before I got involved. You want a villain? Fine, paint me as the villain, but don't pretend you're here for justice. You're here for spectacle." There was no applause, no murmur of agreement. The gallery remained still, watching, processing, recoiling. Because what Mike Johnson failed to understand in that moment was that volume is not proof, and defensiveness is not strength. The more he spoke, the clearer it became. He wasn't answering questions. He was trying to outrun them. His voice reverberated through the chamber like a door slamming shut, loud, jarring, but unmistakably hollow. The air in the hearing room was already stretched thin, the atmosphere brittle with tension. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. Not yet. She stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on Mike Johnson, her voice calm but unyielding. "Since we're debating facts," she said almost quietly, "let me offer one more." She pressed a single key. The screen faded to black. Then came sound. Not polished testimony, not legal jargon, but the unmistakable hum of a live recorded call. No soundtrack, no spin, just reality captured raw. A male voice filled the chamber, calm, professional, resigned. "Senator Johnson instructed us to accelerate the removals in Ward 7, it said. His words were clear. "We need those units cleared before Lexington releases funds. Make it clean, push it through legal, but don't wait." No one in the room moved. The recording played like a confession with no room for misinterpretation. It didn't suggest, it confirmed. The voice didn't sound vindictive. It sounded tired, as if the speaker had been carrying this weight for too long. Jasmine didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The silence after the recording ended was more powerful than any commentary. It was the sound of a lie collapsing in real time. Even the most hardened aides looked shaken. The gallery held its breath. The oxygen in the room seemed to vanish. Mike Johnson blinked. For the first time all morning, he looked truly exposed. Not politically, but personally. He tried to sit taller, but there was no posture left to hold. The flush in his face had drained, leaving behind something paler, thinner. He leaned forward, hands flat on the desk, and spoke without conviction. I I don't manage every operational detail, he said. His voice lacked its earlier bite. It didn't even reach the back of the room. The words hung in the air, frail and unfinished, like a dropped curtain on a stage no longer under his control. But no one was asking about operational detail. What hung over him now wasn't a question of logistics. It was one of intent. The recording didn't implicate a system. It implicated him, and everyone knew it. The residue of the recording still clung to the chamber like smoke when Jasmine turned calmly toward the committee clerk. Her voice, barely above a whisper, was absolute. "Call the next witness." Chairs shifted, heads turned, and from the side entrance a man stepped forward. Not a lawyer, not a polished political operative, but someone who wore the quiet fatigue of long service. He looked to be in his mid-50s, hair thinning, shoulders slightly hunched, the edges of his suit just a bit too worn. He didn't walk with urgency. He walked like someone who knew what it meant to carry something too long and had finally decided to put it down. He took the oath, sat at the witness table, and folded his hands. Jasmine's voice guided him gently into the spotlight. "Please state your name and former position with the Urban Rescue Initiative." He cleared his throat and spoke without embellishment. "My name is Thomas Grady. I served as a senior data analyst in the Planning and Zoning Subcommittee for Phase 1 of the Urban Rescue Initiative." He paused, steadying himself. "I was on the internal task force responsible for identifying redevelopment zones. Our job was to run demographic reports, cross-reference income, property ownership, and density metrics to determine which neighborhoods would be prioritized." He looked directly at the panel now, his voice growing firmer, as if each word peeled back a layer of silence. "We were instructed to develop what they called a viability matrix. That matrix included columns for median income, ethnic composition, rental concentration, and voting history. If a neighborhood had a high percentage of renters making under $20,000 a year, it was flagged." He blinked, voice tightening. "The phrase we heard in our closed meetings was population filtering. Specifically, we were told to clear the central corridor. The order was explicit. Remove low-yield residents, low yield meaning low income, so that the district could be revalued and repositioned for high-end investment." There was a rustle among the audience. On the dais, several lawmakers shifted uneasily in their seats. The room had heard injustice before, but this was strategy. This was design. Grady exhaled sharply and finished. "We weren't planning renewal. We were cleansing a map." That's the word that was used in one internal memo. Cleansing. Before the shock could settle, Mike Johnson, tense, visibly rattled, leaned forward and cut in, his voice louder than necessary. "Perjury is a federal crime, Mr. Grady," he said. "You better be damn sure of what you're putting on the record." Grady didn't even flinch, but Jasmine rose slowly, turning toward Johnson with a calm that felt like a blade sliding from its sheath. "And covering the truth with silence," she said, "isn't just cowardice. It's complicity." Her voice did not tremble. It rang out with the weight of something final, something irreversible. In that moment, it wasn't about who shouted louder. It was about who had dared to speak at all. And Mike Johnson, for all his power, had just threatened a man for telling the truth under oath, in a room already drowning in proof. The echo of Jasmine's last rebuke still reverberated through the chamber when she turned back toward the projector, her steps slow, precise. The room hadn't recovered from the witness testimony, but she wasn't about to let the momentum bleed. She reached down and tapped the spacebar. The lights dimmed again, and this time, the screen filled not with documents, but with a short video. Shaky, intimate, too real to ignore. The footage opened on a small, weathered home. Red brick facade, chipped white trim, a rusted screen door that hung slightly crooked. The front yard was neat but modest. A plastic tricycle sat by the steps. A worn welcome mat lay crooked by the entrance. In the corner of the screen, a timestamp read, March 14th, 2023, 6:12 a.m. The voice behind the camera was a woman's, clear, tired, but trying to stay composed. This was my mother's house. She bought it in 1982. They came last week and said it was part of the redevelopment zone. Said we had to go. She stepped back to show a white notice paper, stapled to the front door like an eviction flag. Zooming in, the camera caught the bold header. Notice of Acquisition under Slum Redevelopment Act. Section 8C. Beneath it, in dry bureaucratic ink, was the stated compensation. $11,230. They said it's fair, the woman continued, her voice cracking just slightly. They said the future value is going to be over $300,000, but we're not part of that future. The camera panned briefly to a little boy peeking out from behind the curtains. He couldn't have been more than 6. "Mama," he whispered, "are they taking my room?" Then the screen went black. The room was motionless. Jasmine let the silence hang, not because she needed the drama, but because it was the only way to give the audience time to feel what they'd just seen. When she finally spoke, her voice was as sharp and as still as a scalpel cutting into silence. "That home," she said, "was professionally assessed at $320,000. That's not an estimate. That's the listed market valuation from 3 separate municipal reports filed between 2021 and 2023. And yet, under the language of the Slum Redevelopment Act, the family was awarded $11,230. Not because that's what the home was worth." She held up a printed legal document, its lines highlighted in furious yellow. "But because Section 12 limits compensation to no more than 5% of the projected post-development investment value." She stepped forward, voice low but burning. "Not current value, not fair market rate, not relocation cost, projected investment value." Her eyes locked on Johnson. In other words, they were paid based on what someone else might make after the bulldozers come, after the neighborhood is cleared, after the profit is realized. She paused. "But none of that belongs to the family who lived there for 41 years. Not the land, not the memories, not even a fair check." A tight rustle moved through the crowd. No one whispered. It was the kind of physical reaction people had when their bodies couldn't contain the outrage. Then Jasmine read directly from the contract. "In no case shall awarded compensation exceed 5% of projected reinvestment appraisal as calculated by authorized development partners." She looked up again. That phrase, authorized development partners, refers to Lexington Growth Fund and its affiliates, the very same investors we've just linked to political donations, zoning manipulation, and forced displacement strategies. She clicked the projector off. The room plunged into full light. The weight of what had just been shown and spoken left no room for interpretation. It wasn't just injustice. It was engineered, codified, monetized. The kind of injustice that wears a suit and carries a spreadsheet. She didn't need to raise her voice. "You see, Mr. Johnson," she said, "this isn't about urban revitalization. It's about rewriting the definition of value to mean only one thing: profit." Her voice dropped half a register. "And it's about rewriting who counts and who gets counted." Then she stopped speaking. Not because she was finished, but because it was his turn. Across the room, Mike Johnson hadn't moved in nearly a minute. His eyes were no longer scanning the room, no longer darting between allies or searching for the right angle. They were down, fixed somewhere on the blank desk in front of him, as if he could will it to swallow him. The cameras, relentless and unblinking, zoomed in. Not on a man in command, not on a policymaker holding firm, but on a man who had no script left, no pivot, no shield, only silence, and a truth he could no longer outrun. The chamber was no longer just tense. It was suffocating, thick with the weight of everything that had just been revealed. The family paid pennies for a home, the internal memos, the financial links, the trembling voice of a man who had built the machine and then stood up to confess it. Jasmine stood with that silence still clinging to the corners of the room, and then stepped forward again. Slower this time, heavier, as if every inch she crossed brought her closer to something irreversible. She didn't look at her notes. She didn't need to. Her voice came low, deliberate, but sharp enough to cut through every layer of denial left in the building. "Let's be honest now," she began, eyes locked on Johnson. "This isn't about data. This isn't about zoning. This isn't even about development. This is about who gets to exist in your version of the future. Her hand hovered over the thick binder of eviction records and settlement agreements, but she didn't reach for it. She didn't have to. In the last 11 months alone, she continued, enunciating every syllable with surgical precision, your urban rescue initiative forcibly removed 17,400 people from their homes. She let the number sink in, then repeated it, slower. 17,400 gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience seats behind her. Jasmine didn't flinch. That's not growth. That's not progress. That's displacement on a scale most people in this room cannot imagine. And I want you, Mr. Johnson, to answer for that. I want you to tell the public right now, who did you design this for? Who did you decide gets to stay? And who, in your plan, is discarded like they were nothing but clutter? Then her voice dropped, heavier still. Tell me, sir, in your version of America, who is kept and who is called trash? The last word didn't echo. It dropped like a stone. The entire room inhaled as one, but Mike Johnson's face flushed before anyone else could move. His spine stiffened. He leaned forward, the calm mask torn from his expression. Gone was the polished, patronizing smirk he had entered with. What replaced it was raw anger, undignified and exposed. Don't you dare! He snapped, his voice sharp and defensive. Don't you put that kind of language in my mouth. That's not what I said. That's not how I operate. His words came too fast, too loud, as though he was trying to shout down not Jasmine, but the truth that had already entered the room and taken its seat beside him. But Jasmine didn't blink. She stood still as granite, the fire in her gaze refusing to flicker. She stepped one pace closer, never raising her voice. I didn't put it there, she said. Your policy did. Her voice was almost quiet now, steady, cutting, undeniable. When you approve a project that removes thousands of poor families and replaces them with luxury condos, when your spreadsheets calculate value based on projected investor returns, not human lives, when your team calls low-income areas zones of opportunity only after clearing them of the very people who gave those neighborhoods their soul, then no, you don't have to say the word trash. She paused, because your decisions already did. The silence that followed was different now, no longer shocked, just damning. Even the Republican members of the committee who had smiled earlier now looked away, hands fidgeting with pens or paper cups, as if some part of them realized this wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was an unmasking. Mike Johnson sat frozen, mouth slightly open, as if reaching for a rebuttal that refused to come. The cameras focused in, first on his eyes, dodging hers, and then on the nameplate in front of him, now looking out of place beneath the weight of everything he could no longer deny. Jasmine leaned in, not to intimidate, but to finish what she had started. We've heard a lot about what this initiative builds, but what we haven't heard, she said, her voice tightening like a final note in a symphony, is who it destroys. You don't get to hide behind fancy brochures or PR buzzwords like revitalization. You don't get to call this compassion while wiping out entire communities with ink and signature stamps. You don't get to speak of lifting people up while your policies shove them out. She took a breath, not from fatigue, but from restraint. So no, Congressman Johnson, I'm not twisting your words. I'm mirroring your impact. And if that reflection makes you uncomfortable, it's because it should. The air held that final sentence like a verdict, and for the first time all morning, Johnson didn't interrupt. He didn't lean back. He didn't smirk or scoff or signal to his aides. He just sat there, quiet beneath the crushing weight of every word he had just heard. And this time, the silence belonged to Jasmine. The silence that followed Jasmine's final sentence wasn't just stillness. It was weight, heavy, suffocating, the kind that settles on a room when something true has been said and no one can deny it. Mike Johnson remained motionless, jaw clenched, hands tight around the edge of the desk as if gripping it kept him from unraveling. But Jasmine wasn't done. Not yet. She didn't retreat. She didn't pause for applause or dramatics. She simply looked at the chairman and gave a quiet nod. Permission to enter Exhibit 47B into the record, she said. The chairman, still visibly stunned, managed a nod. Jasmine turned back to her laptop. This time there was no map, no video, no victim crying on screen. Just audio. She clicked play, and the room filled with the faint hum of a conference call. The quality scratchy, but the voices unmistakably clear. "Let's be candid here," said a smooth male voice. Confident, comfortable, unhurried. "This is a historic opportunity to finally clean up these districts, reset the game board. We're not just building new space, we're clearing out the dead weight." A few heads lifted. The tension surged. "Look," the voice continued, "I know the optics are tricky, but frankly, these people don't bring market value. They don't attract investment. They bring problems. We need tenants who know how to spend, not people who just know how to complain." Jasmine didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The words from the recording did more than any argument ever could. They burned. The air in the chamber turned electric. Members shifted in their seats. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God!" The tone of the man on the recording, casual, rich, untouched, was worse than if he had shouted slurs. He wasn't angry. He wasn't emotional. He was strategic, talking about human lives like they were obstacles on a profit sheet. The voice returned, even colder this time. "Once we get the fund through phase 3, Lexington will recoup the investment within 18 months, especially once the holdouts are cleared. It's just math. The longer we delay, the more emotional it gets. And emotions don't belong in this conversation." At that line, Jasmine pressed pause. The room stopped breathing. She looked up, slowly, deliberately, and met Johnson's eyes across the chamber. And for the first time since the hearing began, he looked away first. The projector screen behind her froze on the audio waveform. It looked like a seismograph, like the room itself had registered an earthquake. In many ways, it had. Jasmine walked back toward the microphone. Her voice was quieter now, not because she was unsure, but because sometimes whispers are sharper than screams. That call was from a private meeting between representatives from Lexington Growth Fund and members of the Urban Development Council, she said. It was recorded by a whistleblower last fall. The voice you heard belonged to Robert F. Mears, lead strategist for the Lexington Municipal Investment Arm. She raised her eyes and delivered the next line not to the chairman, but to the cameras. "The fund that donated $2.1 million to Congressman Johnson's PAC last year." There was no laughter now, no smirks, not even whispers, just stunned stillness. She turned slightly, scanning the faces of the committee. "They said, and I quote, 'These people don't bring market value.' As if that justifies what's been done to them. As if being poor means you're disposable. As if families who've lived in the same house for generations deserve to be erased because they don't hold a platinum Amex." She faced Johnson again. "And you, sir, told this committee you were building opportunity, that you were rescuing communities." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "But behind closed doors, your partners were already calling them trash." The silence cracked. It wasn't a sound, but a shift. Like the atmosphere itself had turned against him. All eyes went to Johnson. He didn't speak, didn't blink. For the first time, he had nothing. Cameras zoomed in, not out of routine, but because this was a moment too human to miss. His face was pale now, jaw clenched, hands suddenly still. The trademark smirk, gone. The posturing, gone. What remained was a man cornered, not by political enemies, but by his own record. Jasmine stepped forward once more. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "You didn't have to say the word worthless, Congressman Johnson. Your policies said it for you. Your partners said it behind locked doors. And now the people know." She lifted the printed transcript of the recording and placed it on the desk in front of her. "Let the record show," she said, not to the chairman but to history itself, "that they didn't just displace people. They dehumanized them. And they did it with money, with contracts, and with the quiet approval of men who were elected to serve." She paused, holding her breath, then released it like a final shot across the bow. "We don't get to pretend anymore." Then, without waiting for a reply, Jasmine turned off the screen. The waveform vanished. The lights returned to full brightness. But the shadows in the room, they stayed. Mike Johnson sat as if he'd aged a decade in 10 minutes. He reached for his water but didn't drink it. His hands shook just enough for the cameras to catch. And the recorders, oh, they caught everything. The moment power cracked. The moment truth broke through. And above it all, Jasmine stood still, not victorious, but necessary. A witness, a prosecutor, and a voice for those no one else invited into the room. The hearing was still far from over. But in that moment, one thing was clear. The rescue wasn't urban, it was moral. And Jasmine Crockett had just pulled the city back from the edge. The room was no longer a courtroom. It had become a reckoning. The weight of what had just unfolded still hung in the air. Raw, unprocessed, like smoke from a fire not yet extinguished. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it all, but she did not move for applause. She did not lower her eyes. She stood completely still, shoulders squared, gaze fixed, not at the committee, not at Mike Johnson, but directly into the camera. There was no paper in her hands now, no binder, no screen behind her, nothing but the truth, standing upright in heels. She stepped forward once, then paused. Every heartbeat in the room waited on her next word. Her voice came low, steady, and stripped of every political flourish. It was not the voice of a congresswoman addressing colleagues. It was the voice of someone speaking to an entire nation and refusing to blink. They always tell us poverty is a problem of the poor, she said slowly, as if choosing each word from a battlefield of options. They say it's a matter of bad choices, of bad habits, of people who didn't try hard enough. Her voice did not rise, but it pressed harder with every word. But that's not what we saw here today. That's not what the evidence showed. What we saw is that poverty is not a flaw. It is a consequence. She raised her chin just slightly. Poor people are not the failure of the system, she said, eyes burning now. They are the victims of people who call crime a development strategy. Gas moved through the audience like a ripple across water. And then, a sound no one expected. A single clap, then another, then 5, then a dozen. A wave of hands rising in defiance of protocol. These hearings did not allow public applause, but this moment refused silence. The sound wasn't loud, but it was sharp, like hail on glass. Some clapped with tears in their eyes, others with clenched fists. Each clap a protest, each clap a sentence of its own. The chairman began to gavel for order, but even he faltered. He knew what this moment was, and he knew he couldn't stop it. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't look around. She didn't acknowledge the applause. She simply kept her eyes forward, piercing, unwavering, almost biblical in their steadiness. And then she said what no one else in the chamber had dared to say. In cities across this country, she continued, people are being priced out of existence, not because they failed, but because someone in a boardroom decided their existence was inconvenient to a quarterly return. And those people, she paused, voice narrowing to a whisper, don't have PACs. They don't have lobbyists. All they have is the hope that someone will speak truth in the room where decisions are made. Another beat, another breath. She leaned in just slightly toward the microphone. And that's what we did here today. Behind her, the screen was dark now, but the truth still echoed through every corner of the room. And then it happened. Mike Johnson stood up. No words, no rebuttal, no final retort to reclaim the floor. He simply gathered the folder in front of him, though it was clearly empty now in every sense, and stepped back from the table. The cameras followed him, uncertain. His steps were slow, measured, but his face was no longer composed. There was no smile, no smirk, no calculation left. He didn't nod. He didn't look back. He walked out as if somehow he knew that the story had already been written, and it would not carry his name as the hero. The doors clicked behind him like a gavel strike. And Jasmine? She remained standing. There was no celebration in her posture, no gloating, only the quiet fire of someone who had held the line when it mattered and refused to let the powerful rewrite what the powerless had lived. She looked back to the chairman now. I yield, she said calmly. But everyone in that room knew she hadn't yielded anything. The people in the back, those whose names never made the news, whose homes had been bulldozed for someone else's skyline, sat motionless. One woman clutched her purse tighter, tears welling. An older man nodded slowly. Somewhere near the aisle, a teenager in a school hoodie stood and mouthed, "Thank you." Because Jasmine hadn't just confronted corruption, she had named it, stripped it, and lit it on fire. And though this was just one hearing, one morning, one building in Washington, D.C., its tremors would reach further than anyone in that room could measure. For some, it would be a headline. For others, it would be a warning. But for those who had nothing, it was the first time in a long time that someone had said aloud what they always knew, that they were never the mistake. The mistake was believing no one would ever fight for them. And on this day, someone finally did. The doors to the hearing chamber had long since shut behind Mike Johnson, but the impact of what had transpired lingered like smoke after fire. The gallery still sat frozen, not out of confusion, but because no one wanted to move too soon and break the spell. Jasmine Crockett had not merely survived a political ambush, she had turned it inside out. But the true moment of power wasn't when Johnson walked out in disgrace. It was now, in the silence that followed, when the real reckoning began. Jasmine remained seated for a long moment, her posture upright, her eyes fixed not on her peer, but on the audience behind her, on the housing advocates, the displaced families, the activists, the volunteers. They hadn't come for a spectacle. They had come for recognition, and she had given them that. But recognition wasn't enough. Not anymore. Now came the harder part, the part no camera could dramatize and no gavel could control. She stood slowly, then stepped forward again, not toward the committee, but toward the press pool, where the nation's eyes waited. She ignored the microphones. She ignored the flashing lights. And then, as if speaking to a room filled with ghosts, she began, "You all saw what happened today, but don't mistake this for a victory lap, because today was not a win. It was a warning." She paused, her voice steady but low. The room leaned in. "We live in a system that confuses legality with morality, that wraps exploitation in legislation and calls it growth, that reduces human lives to development zones, tax brackets, and project phases. And today we saw the mask slip." Another pause. "You heard them say it wasn't about race or class or power, but look where the bulldozers went. Look who got evicted at 3 a.m. Look who received $11,000 for a house worth $300,000. Look who was called market waste behind closed doors." The air grew tighter with each word. "And the most dangerous part," she continued, her eyes scanning the room, "it wasn't the deals, it wasn't the contracts, it was the silence. The silence of the people who knew, who saw, who benefited, and said nothing. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the machinery of injustice doesn't need cruelty to operate. It only needs comfort. It only needs enough people willing to look away." Her voice hardened. "But we're not looking away anymore." From the far corner, someone whispered, "Amen." Jasmine turned slightly toward the camera lens now. And to every person watching this from a shelter, a motel, or the backseat of a car, hear me when I say this. You are not invisible, you are not disposable, and you are not alone. She drew a breath, her voice briefly catching, but she did not stop. You've been told you're a problem to be solved, a cost to be minimized, a footprint to be reduced. But the truth is, you are the soul of this country, the ones who raise children without safety nets, who work 2 jobs and still skip meals, who hold entire communities together while others cash dividends off your suffering. The room was silent now, not out of fear, but reverence. And to those in power who watched this hearing and felt embarrassed, threatened, or exposed, good. You should be. Because if you don't feel discomfort when injustice is laid bare, then you've lost the only compass that matters. She stepped closer to the center of the room. There is no urban rescue without the people who live in the city. There is no revitalization that starts with eviction. And there is no progress if it leaves behind the very people who built these communities, brick by brick, block by block. Jasmine then lowered her voice. This isn't about one man. This isn't about Mike Johnson. This is about a system that rewards dispossession and punishes compassion. A system where being poor is seen as a character flaw, and helping the poor is seen as political suicide. She let the silence fall again. Not to pause, to let the truth linger like a bruise. But here's the lesson we walk away with today, she said, her voice rising just a notch. That dignity is not a luxury, it is a right. That housing is not a favor, it is a foundation. That justice must be built from the bottom up, not handed down from penthouses. And then she smiled, the first real smile all day. Because they forgot something. They thought we would break. They thought we'd stay quiet. But we didn't. And we won't. Not tomorrow, not next year, not ever again. Applause tried to rise again, but Jasmine raised a hand gently. She wasn't finished. We have a long road ahead, laws to change, agencies to audit, developers to hold accountable, but the most urgent task is harder than any of that. She looked back to the gallery. It's to teach this country how to feel again, to remind it what a home means, not just four walls, but safety, not just an address, but identity, not just ownership, but belonging. Now every camera lens locked on her. And that is the new measure of policy, not how much GDP it creates, but how many children it protects, how many elders it shelters, how many lives it dignifies. The air was different now, no longer electric with confrontation, but charged with meaning. Jasmine could feel it, so she said the final words not with volume, but with gravity. We are not the ones who need saving. We are the ones who were never seen. And today, that changed. With that, she stepped back. The room remained still. Even reporters put their pens down. In the hallway, as Jasmine exited into the late afternoon sun, a teenage boy approached her. He wore a backpack too large for his frame, and his shoes were taped at the soles. He didn't ask for a selfie. He didn't ask for a quote. He just said, "My mom was scared, but after today, she's not anymore." Jasmine knelt slightly, looked him in the eyes. "Tell her she never had to be," she replied. "The fear was never hers to carry. It belonged to the people who knew what they were doing was wrong and prayed no one would say it out loud." And with that, she walked forward, not away from the fight, but deeper into it, because that was the final lesson. You don't need to hold power to deliver justice. You just have to refuse to be silent 1 minute longer. The crowd began to thin from the Capitol steps, the tension finally bleeding into the afternoon light. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't left. Not yet. She stood just outside the hearing chamber doors, her silhouette cast long across the marble floor, speaking quietly with a few staffers and community leaders. The hearing was over. The evidence had been exposed. The man behind the curtain had been unmasked. But for her, this wasn't an ending. It was ignition. She turned toward the crowd that remained. Not reporters this time, but people. Citizens, survivors, mothers with strollers, grandparents leaning on walkers, students with notebooks, janitors still in uniform, people who had been called invisible by the very system that claimed to rescue them. And as Jasmine stepped up to the impromptu podium, a makeshift mic rigged to a city worker's flatbed, the noise faded. Again. Because they knew what was coming was more than a speech. It was a summons. Her voice didn't shake. "Today, you watched the curtain fall," she said, eyes sweeping across the crowd. "You saw how easily words like revitalization and rescue are used to disguise what is, in truth, erasure. You heard them talk about strategy when they meant eviction. You heard them call displacement an opportunity." She paused, the anger in her voice not uncontrolled, but earned. "But let me tell you something. They made one mistake they'll never recover from. They let the cameras roll. They let the truth breathe. And now the lie can't be put back in the box." The crowd stirred. Jasmine didn't wait for applause. "This isn't about what happened in that room. It's about what happens next. And if we walk away today feeling satisfied, if we call this a victory and move on, then we become complicit in the very silence that allowed this to fester." She took a breath, then raised her voice, not in volume, but in weight. "So I'm asking you, no, I'm calling on you, Not to cheer, not to repost a clip, but to act. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at her blazer. She didn't flinch. I want every displaced family to know this. We will not let your stories be buried beneath concrete and campaign checks. I want every investor who backed these deals to know you are not untouchable, and I want every policymaker still hiding behind paperwork to remember this is your wake-up call. The crowd began nodding. Phones rose, but Jasmine was only beginning. This is what we do now, she said, voice gaining momentum. We organize tenants. We challenge zoning boards. We rewrite ordinances. We file class actions. We build legal clinics in barbershops. We take protest chants and turn them into policy. She stepped down from the platform and walked into the crowd as she spoke. Not above them, but among them. We build city councils that don't need lobbyists to remind them who they serve. We audit every redevelopment deal that smells of backroom compromise, and we make it impossible for another so-called urban rescue initiative to be funded without public oversight, equity impact reviews, and local control. A woman in the front row shouted, "Where do we start?" Jasmine turned to her, pointing gently. "Right there. That question. That's the spark." She motioned to the back of the crowd where younger activists stood with clipboards. You sign up, you write letters, you show up at 6 a.m. when city council buries votes and hidden agendas. You get your neighbors to understand that gentrification isn't just a buzzword, it's a knife, slow and quiet. Now her voice hardened into something more forceful. They bank on your exhaustion. They bank on your disbelief. They think if they drag it out long enough, you'll forget, that you'll move, that you'll break, but you won't. A silence fell like a curtain drop. Because here's the truth they never planned for. Once people understand how power works, they don't just get angry, they get organized. The phrase echoed like a rallying cry. Someone repeated it, then another, then 20 voices at once. They get organized. Jasmine climbed back onto the platform. And don't let them tell you this is too complex, that you need a PhD to understand housing code, that only experts can talk about tax credits. Because you know who's an expert? The single mother evicted with 20 days' notice, the grandfather forced out of a rent-controlled home with nowhere to go, the child who lost her school when a luxury development replaced an entire block. She shook her head. Don't you ever let them convince you that your experience isn't data, that your pain isn't policy. The crowd surged forward, less like an audience now, more like an army forming. We hold teach-ins in laundromats. We speak truth in town halls built to suppress it. We show up to campaign events with receipts and timelines. We pull back the veil everywhere. She pointed toward the Capitol dome behind her. And we remind that building every day that democracy doesn't live in marble columns. It lives in resistance. It lives in voices raised together. It lives in the refusal to be forgotten. Now the applause came, thunderous, rolling, from young and old, from angry and hopeful. It wasn't celebration, it was commitment. Jasmine's final words came not as a plea, but as an invocation. We don't need to tear the system down. We need to stop letting it be built on our backs. We don't need another speech. We need another 1,000 people who refuse to be silent. Her voice dropped low. And when the next hearing comes, because it will, we won't just walk in with documents. We'll walk in with districts, with data, with people. And this time, they won't be able to look away. A teenage boy stepped up and handed her a handmade sign. Rescue the people, not the property. She held it high, and then she walked into the street, into the crowd, into the next battle. Because action wasn't a choice anymore. It was the only language power understood. The sun had dipped below the Capitol dome by the time Jasmine finally stepped away from the crowd. Her voice was raw, but her pulse steady. She had delivered her warning, not just to the architects of injustice, but to the nation. And the nation had heard her. But action, as she well knew, was never won on the Capitol steps alone. That evening, as night fell over Washington, the clip of Jasmine's speech surged across every platform like a current, with no dam strong enough to hold it. Not just the highlights of the hearing, but the moment she had stood among the people, declaring war on silence. It flooded group chats in housing coalitions. It played on loop inside community centers from Oakland to Baltimore. It wasn't just viral, it was galvanizing. She had struck something deeper than outrage. She had struck clarity. At 9:04 p.m., the Lexington Growth Fund released a curt defensive statement claiming mischaracterization. By 9:22 p.m., an anonymous staffer from their finance division had posted 3 leaked memos online. One sentence exploded across the screen in bold type. Delay disbursement until Phase 2 gentrification zones are cleared of low-income resistance groups. Screenshots, red circles, arrows, names. By morning, the fire had jumped from the internet into newsrooms, and from there into legislation. In Austin, a city council vote on a zoning waiver for a revitalization corridor was abruptly postponed. In Philadelphia, a state senator withdrew her sponsorship of a land use bill tied to Johnson's allies. And in Tulsa, a local journalist ran a 2,000-word expose on a similar fund using nearly identical language about demographic reshaping. But Jasmine wasn't watching the coverage. She was already on the phone. By 7:45 a.m., she had spoken with 6 grassroots organizers across 3 states. At 9:13 a.m., she was already drafting a federal proposal, not symbolic but structural, a national transparency registry for urban development funds. By 11 a.m., she was in a closed-door meeting with legal experts, architects, and 2 economists, discussing how to model equity displacement scores into every future SHUD application. Because that was the thing about Jasmine Crockett. She didn't fight battles. She made them irrelevant. And yet, amid the strategy, the movement, the headlines, what remained clearest was a single image. A mother holding her daughter, standing just behind the temporary press barricade the night before. She hadn't said a word. She just stared. Her eyes were full, not of tears, but of memory, of what had been taken, of what might still be restored. Jasmine hadn't forgotten her. She wouldn't. Because this movement wasn't built on sound bites. It was built on faces. And the power that had once dismissed them as numbers now had to answer to names. Later that week, a new billboard appeared just outside Baton Rouge, Louisiana, along a stretch of highway once slated for eminent domain seizure. It read, "You can't rescue a city by erasing its people. Representative Jasmine Crockett." The campaign wasn't hers. A local union had paid for it, but it marked something more important than a quote. It marked a shift in story ownership. The narrative no longer belonged to the developers, or the lobbyists, or the elected who smiled while signing lives away in exchange for glass towers and golf course incentives. It belonged to the people now, and they were done waiting to be saved. They were coming for the blueprint. They were writing it themselves. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.